Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. In a move that will have more negative repercussions for US-China relations, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo last Saturday said he was lifting restrictions on contacts between US officials and their Taiwanese counterparts. In a statement, Pompeo said that for several decades, the State Department had created complex internal restrictions on interactions with Taiwanese counterparts by American diplomats, service members, and other officials. And he went on to say, and I'm quoting directly from what he said, the United States government took these actions unilaterally in an attempt to appease the communist regime in Beijing, he said. He added, today I'm announcing that I'm lifting all of these self-imposed restrictions, unquote. While the United States has no official relations with Taiwan, the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act provides the legal basis for the unofficial relationship between the United States and Taiwan and establishes the U.S. commitment to assist Taiwan in maintaining its defensive capability. The same year, however, the U.S. under the 1979 U.S.-PRC joint communique switched diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. In the joint communique, the United States recognized the government of the PRC as the sole legal government of China. The communique acknowledges Beijing's position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. However, the outgoing Trump administration has ramped up backing for the island country with arms sales and laws to help Taiwan deal with pressure from China. Experts say the move appears to be another effort by the Trump administration to lock in a tough approach to China before Democratic President-elect Joe Biden takes office on 20th January. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Einar Tangen in Beijing. Mr. Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator. With him, I have Ross Feingold in Taipei. Mr. Feingold is head of business development at SafePro Group, a global security and evacuation services firm. Thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with Mr. Tangen here. Mr. Tangen, how do you read this move?
I mean, this is Pompeo acting unilaterally. He has hopes to run for the presidential office in 2024, and he's setting up attack points. But he is a true believer. He does believe that China is the great evil empire and that he is charged with taking them on. So, yeah, it doesn't make any sense. It's 10 days away from a transition where he will be out of office, and everything that he has said and done so far can be undone. But I think he's counting on that. He wants to use these, as I said, as attack points, as things that he can say that he did when he's running for president in 2024. He's not likely to get the nomination. But, you know, as with all of these politicians in Washington, they're always hopeful.
Interesting point, Mr. Tangen. Why do you think Pompeo is so opposed to China? Is there something ideological here?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he describes himself willingly as an evangelical Christian. A few years ago, when he's speaking to his Kansas constituents, he talked about the oncoming end times and how the United States would be the defenders of God and the right against the infidels and those non-believers, that there would be evil. There's a belief in Christian evangelicals that the world will come to an end when Israel is in possession of certain lands. There will be a second coming of the Messiah, a great war. The soldiers of God will battle in a final battle, the soldiers of evil. And to Pompeo, anything that isn't white and Christian appears to be evil. And that includes China. It includes all of the Middle East, Africa, and probably South America.
That's actually pretty dangerous eschatological predictions or beliefs. But stay with me, Mr. Tangen. Let me pull in Ross Feingold here. Ross, what do you say about what Mr. Tangen has said and Pompeo's statement?
The important thing we should keep in mind in framing this discussion is the reality is that these guidelines that Pompeo said are now null. The United States had really slowly over time, and especially over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, not really adhered to these guidelines in a strict fashion anyway. So the interactions between U.S. government officials and Taiwan government officials are fairly common. They're at various levels of seniority, from junior to senior. And they're generally quite open. It's no secret when more junior U.S. government officials visit Taiwan. Of course, there's more attention when a senior government official from the U.S. visits Taiwan. But regular government-to-government interaction occurs on a regular basis. I mean, frankly, the relationship between Taiwan and the United States is similar to how any countries conduct foreign relations, with the one difference being that they simply don't call it official. They don't call it diplomatic relations, but operationally and practically, it's a government-to-government relationship conducted like any countries do. I mean, as much as that angers the government in Beijing, I mean, it is the reality. So doing away with the guidelines, at one level, it's a public relations move, whether for the State Department or for the government in Taiwan. They get some benefit from that. But practically speaking, I don't think we should, we just shouldn't overestimate or give it too much play, even though it's gotten a lot of media attention over the past 48 hours.
Right, but you're right. I mean, it's got a lot of attention, but there are also experts who talk about the fact that this is a very significant move that U.S. administration has made since the joint communique of 1979 that I was talking about. Now, for instance, Bonnie Glasser, who's an Asia expert at Washington's Center for Strategic and International Studies think tank, he said, and this is basically corroborating what you said, examples of the restrictions included Taiwanese officials not being able to enter the State Department, but instead having to meet at hotels. But he has also gone on to talk about the fact that he was talking to Reuters. He said the Biden administration will rightly be unhappy that a policy decisions like this was made in the final days of the Trump administration. Now, having said that, Ross, Mr. Tangen talked about Pompeo's ideological sort of, grounding in evangelical sort of Christian approach and the whole sort of eschatology, that end of times eschatology belief, that comes with it. Now, that is something which is different from pure politics or realpolitik. Give me your sense of that.
Well, speaking from Taipei, the view of, say, the government or the media or the people here in Taiwan, I think it's fair to say they're not looking at the evangelical Christian analysis, right? They're just looking for U.S. support, whether it's government-to-government weapon sales, all of which generally the people or and certainly the government in Taiwan are generally happy with. There's very few voices in Taiwan saying that this is a bad thing. There are some voices that say, well, this is just really public relations, as I was discussing earlier, that practically this doesn't really change much because the guidelines have not been adhered to for the most part anyway. And that's really the challenge, though, in this three-way relationship between Taiwan, China, and the United States, is to keep in mind that there is a population here on Taiwan of 23 million people. And their views on these issues need to be taken into account, whether it's policy decisions by the U.S., by the government of Taiwan, or by the government of China. People in China or the government of China might say that the government of Taiwan is being too aggressive in moving towards independence. On the other hand, the population here in Taiwan did vote for this current government twice. So we have to give some respect to the views of the public. At the same time, it's probably also fair to say that the public here in Taiwan doesn't want to see hostilities get too serious, and they wouldn't obviously support any moves that lead to a military confrontation with China.
Right. Mr. Tangen, Ross Feingold has put some essential points on the table. Would you like to comment in response to those points?
First off, Ross did not answer your question about Pompeo saying, I think.
Yes,
second,
I noticed.
This idea that
I noticed.
Public relations, it's nonsense. There was a one-child China policy. It was signed things. It was the basis of the relationship. They took Taiwan out of the United Nations, removed it. It is not a part of the United Nations, and they moved China into the Security Council. That is not a public relations exercise. That is very serious diplomacy. So this idea that, we don't have to bother about this, no one really cares. Well, it's nonsense and doesn't reflect the reality that China does, in fact, care, and that Taiwan and interference in it is a red line. This is the kind of nonsense that, nations sleepwalk into wars over. So I reject the fact that he will not answer the questions about the kind of apocalyptic views of, Pompeo. And he treats us so lightly.
Right. Ross, another opportunity to you. As I said, I noticed that the ideological part of the question was left unanswered. Would you like to weigh in on that?
And to reflect the views of the public or the government of the media here in Taipei, they're simply not taking into account evangelical or religious motivation.
No, I understand. Decision. I understand. I was asking you, do you think that is something, as an American, that is something that would worry you?
Well, I myself am also not a Christian, so I can't comment on the accuracy of Pompeo's analysis or motivations. Clearly, he's running for president, I think it's safe to say, and he's going to be seeking the support of evangelical voters. On that, I think we could all agree. But I'm not in a position to comment on his motivations or the accuracy with Christian doctrine.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Feingold speaking with us. Let me go back to Mr. Tangen. Mr. Tangen, now, if we do accept this ideological side of Mike Pompeo that you spoke about, then we're actually looking at deep irony because over the last 20 years, the United States has bombed many countries in its war against extremism. So how do we square this extremist ideology with the US's realpolitik and war against extremism elsewhere in the world?
Well, it's not a question of squaring. It's understanding American exceptionalism. This beginning with Ronald Reagan and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United States did not take on its responsibilities in a way that would square with this ideology. In essence, they said that it's our role to be the policeman of the world. We are going to force the world to fit into this cookie cutter of democracy and capitalism that we feel that they should, and we don't care if we break a few eggs while we're making the omelet. So everything has been justified based on that. And if you go back into the beginnings of American exceptionalism, this idea that it's a new country, a new beginning, a new Eden, that was somehow created for the American people by God as opposed to taken from American Indians by force. There's this kind of long-standing justification for what America does. And I think almost every single country in the world has now witnessed this. And you've seen this, most remarkably in America's, our oldest ally in Europe, despite the beggings and pleadings of the Biden administration not to sign a trade deal with China. They went ahead and did it, making it very clear that they do not trust American leadership and that they don't know where America is going, especially since 3 states and 44,000 votes could have changed this election.
Right. Stay with me, Mr. Tangen. I am also joined by Dr. Elizabeth Laurs. Dr. Laurs is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at University of Mary, Washington in Virginia. Professor Laurs, thank you for being on the program. We were discussing this move by US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to lift restrictions with reference to meetings with Taiwanese counterparts. Give me your sense of why that move has been made, because as I was quoting from one of the experts in Washington who said the Biden administration will rightly be unhappy that a policy decision like this was made in the final days of the Trump administration.
Yes, it is unusual to make such a striking change in policy so close to the end of administration. I suspect that the Trump administration announced the change in the rules for one of three reasons, possibly two of three reasons. The first being that President Trump really believed that he was going to have a second term. And if he had a second term, then he would have more time to work on the Taiwan issue. The Trump administration, along with Congress, had signed, pushed into law and then signed into law the Taiwan Assurances Act and the Taiwan Travel Act, both of which said that the United States should allow exchanges of high-level officials between U.S. and Taiwan officials. And so Pompeo's announcement was actually implementing that, carrying it forward. The second reason why the Trump administration may have followed through with this change in policy is that President Trump is quite perturbed by China's behavior over COVID, over Hong Kong, treatment of Hong Kong protesters, the Uyghur issue, as well as cyber espionage and stealing of U.S. intellectual property. And so he, we've seen throughout his administration that he has, hit China with a trade war and some other things. That's the second reason. The third reason is that it puts President Biden, incoming President Biden, in a bit of a box. Okay, he's in a bit of a bind. Will he carry through with his policy? Will he pedal it back? It's going to be difficult for him to pedal it back. President Trump believes that Biden will be softer on China, certainly softer than President Trump has been, and that he knows that Democrats are generally more favorably predisposed toward Beijing, and that he wants the momentum to carry forward. And knowing that a lot of Congress is also, unfavorably disposed toward Beijing, he thinks that he might have a Congress's back in making this change. And in pushing Biden forward, it'll be hard to backpedal.
Right. Very interesting. Of course, I'm going to take these points to Ms. Tangen also. But before I do that, you talked about President Trump thinking that he's going to get a second term and he will have time to deal with the Taiwan issue. When you say that, what exactly does that mean? I mean, how, as you know, 1979, there's the act that establishes unofficial relations between the U.S. and Taiwan, but also the joint communique between the United States and People's Republic of China, which talks about and establishes the one China policy. So when you say he thought that he would have more time to deal with this Taiwan issue, what exactly might he be thinking?
Well, very basically, he would have done this in the second administration instead of in the 11th hour, again, which, it goes against U.S. historic precedent of making sudden moves, 10 days before you walk out the door. I honestly can't anticipate what he would have done next. There's no way that the United States administration would have dropped the one China policy. In likelihood, probably more military exchanges when Taiwan military come to the U.S. academies and the war colleges. They cannot come in uniform. Things along that nature. You can tweak along the edges without having to make huge and dramatic changes. So I suspect that there may have been some more measures, step by step, drip by drip, to heighten U.S. relations with Taiwan in a second Trump administration.
Right. And would you agree that that would end, extrapolating from what you're saying, that would have meant a gradual sort of escalation of adversarial relations with Beijing?
Yeah, Beijing is not going to be happy when the United States does anything really favorable toward Taiwan. Of course, both, Beijing and Washington say, and Taiwan says that they want a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue, and that's the official speak. And so, anytime that the United States does something favorable toward Taiwan that China believes violates China's One China principle, they're going to be upset and say that this does disturb US-China relations. And in fact, it does. And notice that Pompeo said, we cannot be afraid of China's response anymore, indicating we know darn well that these moves really perturb Beijing, but we're not going to have that as a consideration in U.S. policy toward Taiwan anymore.
Right. Mr. Tangen, there's a lot on the table now. Go ahead, sir.
Well, quite frankly, this is not a tea party. This is international relations. In China's constitution, it has that Taiwan is an integral part of mainland China, and they will not. It's a red line for them. I mean, there have been mistakes made about China's resolve. First, in the Korean War. And second, during the war of occupation. I mean, people always discount what China will do. India did so in 1962. China responded not by trying to conquer territory, but by pushing back. People always think that somehow China is going to give way. So what the professor is describing is this kind of incremental pushing China on these issues and expecting that there won't be any retaliation. This is a bright red line. And if you are in China, you understand that completely. They will go to war over this. And so this idea that you can just say, I don't care, that's completely irresponsible.
Right, and what the Hong Kong and the Uyghur issue and cyber espionage that Professor Laurs talked about?
Well, quite frankly, I mean, these are issues that were created. What has China done differently in the last few years? It hasn't. China's rise over the last 40 years has been the problem. There's this existential angst within the United States that a country like China, who has, quote, the wrong system, is being successful, whereas the U.S., which has the, quote, right system, end quote, is doing poorly. So there's this desire to believe that somehow China is evil, that it's cheating, that everything that it does is bad, when in fact China hasn't changed at all. It is simply reacting to the kind of pressure that is being put on it by the United States. So in essence, the U.S. is pushing China to be what? Stronger. Everything that Donald Trump has done in the last 4 years has only made China grow more. China is not weaker than it was before. The deficit is larger than it was when Trump started. So everything that is being done has been contrary to the U.S. interests. So this idea that continue with that and not make a comment on just how erroneous that is kind of interesting.
Right. Professor Laurs, Tangen is making a very important point, with reference to the pressure campaign. Now, we've seen that there's the, sort of pressure campaign on China during the Trump administration, the maximum pressure campaign against Iran in the Middle East. And in terms of both policies, we did not really see any results. I mean, essentially, as being a professor of international affairs, that pressure policy is supposed to, sort of get a state to, or compel a state to fall in line. That has not happened. That's not happened even with a very weak adversary, i.e. Iran. And that was certainly not going to happen against China, which is, the emerging power.
Yeah, pressure policies certainly, of course, take a long time to go into effect. The United States tactic now is to, and particularly under the Biden administration, will be to coordinate more with allies to challenge, aggressive moves, perceived aggressive moves by China. In the South China Sea, in the Asia Pacific, you see the United States reaching out more with the incoming Biden administration, with the allies regarding China. The Trump administration, as you know, was to talk one-on-one with countries. And, some observers have said, that was not effective, and particularly if you alienate your, allies as you have in certain ways, you're not going to have a coordinated response. And so the U.S. Pressure campaign going forward is going to be less unilateral. It'll be more multilateral with, the countries in Asia as well as the countries in Europe.
Right. Now, let me ask you this. When U.S. Experts talk about China's aggressive moves, what exactly do they mean? I ask this because we now have a EU-China trade deal. We have the RCEP, which is now the largest trading bloc in the world. Previous to that, it was the TPP, and that was an essential part of former President Obama's pivot to Asia policy, but President Trump walked out of that. So what kind of allies are we talking about here? With the EU wanting to, do trade with China, with the RCEP, which involves a number of other countries, including 2 Quad members, namely Japan and Australia. So what kind of aggressive moves are we talking about with reference to China, and what kind of allies is President-elect Biden going to rely on to sort of have to check or balance China?
Well, all the countries in Europe, or let's just call it the European Union, and in Asia, look to the United States and China for their economic prosperity. So it makes sense that they're going to sign these free trade agreements because it lowers tariffs on their country's exports, into other countries. And so that's a win-win situation. So, it makes sense that they're going to want to sign on these free trade agreements, put politics aside for the prosperity, of their countries and their economic survival to do so. The biggest area where the United States sees that China is aggressive is, of course, the South China Sea. And that, in violation of the UNCLOS, the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, which specifically states that maritime structures that are submerged at high tide are not islands. And because they're not islands, you cannot claim sovereignty over them. China built them up into artificial islands and then claimed sovereignty and then is militarizing them. And that all violates UNCLOS. And even the Philippines, took China to a court of arbitration, and in 2016 decided that, the waters in the South China Sea are not China's claims to all of the waters and maritime structures within the South China Sea are null and void, but China just continued its behavior there. So, that's the most, egregious, example of aggression that we're talking about. In Europe, there is suspicion, of 5G, for example, Huawei and some of the other companies there, that it would be used by those companies to send information back to Beijing, and the military uses those, businesses uses those, all those networks, all that equipment, and so they're a little bit nervous with that. So the United States, has been pretty effective in getting most of those countries to turn away from Hikvision and Huawei to go to Nokia, Emerson, and a few of the other European companies.
And yet the Europeans think that it's important for them. As a matter of fact, German Chancellor Angela Merkel was instrumental in getting this trade deal pushed through. I would have taken some of these points back to Mr. Tangen, but we lost contact with him, and I've also run out of time. So thank you, Professor Laurs. Thank you also to Mr. Einar Tangen in his absence. At this point, we shall take a short break and return to discuss an announcement by Iran's supreme leader that Iran will not get vaccines from the US and the UK. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Last Friday, Iran's supreme leader banned the government from importing COVID-19 vaccines from the United States and Britain, labeling the Western powers untrustworthy. Iran is the worst hit country in the Middle East as far as COVID is concerned. In a live televised speech, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei raised the prospect of the two longtime adversaries of the Islamic Republic, possibly seeking to spread the infection to other countries. And I quote from the transcription of what he said: "Given our experience with France's HIV-tainted blood supplies, French vaccines aren't trustworthy either." That's what Mr. Khamenei said. He was referring to the country's contaminated blood scandal of the 80s and 90s. However, he said that Iran could secure vaccines from other countries. Though he did not give any details, observers believe he was referring to China and Russia, both Iran's allies. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Dr. Derya Unutmaz. Dr. Unutmaz is Professor of Genomic Medicine at the Jackson Laboratory in Farmington, Connecticut, and Syed Mohammad Marandi. Professor Marandi is an academic and political analyst. But before I go to my panelists, since memories are short, just a reminder of what happened with reference to those blood samples. This was infected blood from France's National Blood Transfusion Center, which caused the deaths of hundreds of French people. And an official investigation showed that senior health officials had ordered the continued use of the blood clotting factor that hemophiliacs need, despite knowing that it had been contaminated. And even after the supplies were banned, contaminated blood was still exported to countries abroad, including Iran, causing the infection and deaths of hundreds of people. In fact, this is interesting that back in 2015, there was much concern in Iran at the visit of then French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius. And as a matter of fact, it was said that Mr. Fabius was instrumental then being the Prime Minister for having, not really prevented the spread of these contaminated blood samples, including those that came to Iran. So having said that, let's get to our discussion. Let me begin with Mr. Marandi here. Mr. Marandi, tell us, there seems to now the geopolitics of adversarial relations also informing the policy on vaccinating the Iranian people against COVID-19. So give us a sense of what's happening there.
If you check the website of Ayatollah Khamenei, you'll see that there was no statement there referring to an intentional spread of the virus. That is not what he said. I would be very wary about Western media sources because they tend to distort what he says intentionally. Basically, he was saying that the American the mRNA, what he was referring to basically was the new mRNA technology. It is not tested enough yet. It is a new technology, and that the Iranians are concerned about using this technology, which is just recently been the Americans very rapidly produced the virus. The technology had never been used before. It will take years to find out what sort of side effects it will have. And thus the leader was basically saying, we don't want to have Iranians being experimented upon using this technology. So it has nothing to do with if it was a normal vaccine produced in the with methods that are more pervasive, methods that have been used before. The Iranian vaccine itself is based upon technology technologies that have been used for a very long time. That there's no problem with that. So the issue is not that it is an American vaccine. The issue is that they have not adequately proved either the efficacy or safety, especially for the long term, and the potential side effects that the new mRNA technology may have, and thus the vaccines may have in the long run.
Okay. This translation is from Reuters, and there have been other translations also. So I'm happy that you pointed out, because obviously since we don't know Persian, we have to rely on how the speech or what he said has been translated. But given the fact that he did not say what he did, why did he refer to, or did he actually refer to Iran seeking vaccines from other friendly countries? Is that report correct, or is that also some kind of twist?
He didn't mention anything about friendly countries. He mentioned these two countries in particular, and what he was, and the focus really is the mRNA vaccines, and that he does not want these vaccines to be used in this country. And it's not just the vaccine itself; it's the very fact that the Americans and the British have been actively imposing sanctions on Iran, especially including the financial sector. And we have just to purchase vaccines, we've had it took 40 days for Iran to move money, and that's because the Americans and the British, the British helping the Americans and cooperating with the Americans. So the Iranians, which have so much difficulty transferring money because of the American sanctions, who's to say that if the Iranians transfer that money to the United States, that will not be taken by some court in the United States, or through some mechanism, that money won't be confiscated. We have zero trust in the United States. They're already sanctioning our country. They're trying to prevent Iran from bringing in the equipment they need for the Iranian sanction. They've tried to prevent Iran from importing masks, ventilators, test kits. We have the Americans are trying desperately to prevent Iran from importing or exporting anything. So there's no trust in Iran, but that's just one side of the story. The second side of the story, as I said, is the very fact that this particular technology is new. The side effects are unclear, and therefore the Iranians don't want to risk it.
Right. Now, this is exactly the point where I need to pull in Professor Unutmaz on this. Professor Unutmaz, with reference to technology, with reference to the fact that it's not properly tested, give us your sense of whether that is accurate.
Unfortunately, that's not accurate. I can tell you for a fact, I've been doing immunology and vaccine research for 30 years. And just 3 days ago, I had the mRNA vaccine on my arm. I'm that confident. The way this technology works is that the piece of the virus that you can see on the back, on the surface, which you can call it as the sort of the key of the virus that opens the lock, you need to educate the immune system so that it can stop that from entering into the cells. RNA is basically a piece of program, a code, that tells the cells, please produce this protein and then show it to the immune system. That's it. And it does it in a very transient way. The mRNA itself is destroyed within hours. In fact, that was the major problem that people had to work for years to make the mRNA more stable so it can last a little bit longer. So there is no such thing as a long-term effect from the vaccine per se, because the mRNA is gone. The vaccine is gone. It does not enter into your genome. It does not change your genetics. That is impossible in terms of the biological sense. What could happen is a potential immune response that could turn into some sort of an autoimmunity in an extremely rare condition down the road. But that could happen with any vaccine. That has nothing to do with the mRNA vaccine. Our concern with the mRNA vaccine was short-term effects because the mRNA is, as your previous speaker pointed out, is a new technology, hadn't been tested before, although it had been tried for cancer vaccines. And we were concerned that whether within days, weeks, or even a couple of months, you would see an effect of the vaccine itself. But I just don't buy this long-term effect issue. Now, here's the scenario. We have a pandemic which is killing tens of thousands of people every day. I think Iran is one of the most affected countries in the world. Tens of thousands of people have already died. And here's a vaccine that has already been injected into almost 10 million people. There are no deaths. There were a couple of allergic reactions, 1 in 100,000 rate, which were people who already had allergic reaction. And it's not against the mRNA, by the way. It's a component within the vaccine. And it was handled in a hospital. This is the situation we're working with. So I think I don't understand the politics. Of course, that's a separate issue. People should try to get any vaccine that has some effectiveness. That's something that I would absolutely endorse, whether it's from China, Russia, it doesn't matter, whatever vaccine you can get. But I think one should really be fair that these mRNA, in fact, I would go even further saying that the mRNA technology is going to revolutionize vaccine field, not only for infectious diseases, but also for cancer, potentially for autoimmunity. By the way, the company that first produced is a German company, BioNTech, and two of the founders are Turkish origin, from Turkey, who migrated to Germany. So it is possible to get the vaccine from Germany as well. And they've been working, they've just recently published a paper showing that the mRNA technology can potentially cure multiple sclerosis. It's just a reverse way of using that. So I think this notion that the mRNA, we don't know what will happen years in the future, is not a correct way of stating the technology.
Right. One question before I wrap this up. So all the vaccines, whether it's the Pfizer vaccine or the Oxford and other Chinese vaccines, all of them are using this technology, or is there any difference?
No, they're different. There's currently 2 companies that have approved for this technology for a vaccine. One is BioNTech, which teamed up with Pfizer, and so it's called Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. That was the first one that was approved in both England and US, and then later in Europe. In many other countries, by the way, for example, some of the Middle Eastern countries as well. And then the second one is Moderna. It's a new company that has the same technology. Other vaccines use very different technologies. For example, China has several vaccines, one of which will be used in Turkey, in Brazil, and Indonesia. It's called an inactive vaccine. So this is an old technology where you take the virus, you quote unquote kill it and make it inactive, and then you use that to immunize the immune system. The problem with that is that it's an old technology. It's less effective. For example, the mRNA has a protection rate of 95%. So 95% of people are completely protected, whereas the inactive vaccine, although we don't know for sure, it seems to be around 70% protection from Brazil and Indonesia, reports from those. But regardless, even 70% protection at this point is very, very important, but they use very different technology. AstraZeneca, which is the third vaccine that was approved in England, it's a collaboration with Oxford in England, uses an adenovector. So it's a sort of a packaging this code of the virus into another virus that's sort of harmless, and you deliver that piece into the cells. Russians have a very similar technology. Another company, Johnson & Johnson, is also working on that. And then there's a fourth technology, a company called Novavax, which we're very hopeful about. They develop the vaccine using the protein itself. So they make the protein of this surface protein of the virus and then deliver that. It's not the code anymore. And those results should come out within the next few weeks as phase 3 trials.
Right. Very quickly, Professor Marandi, before I wrap up, Professor Unutmaz has given us a detailed sort of overview of what's happening there, and he's saying that this technology is perfectly safe.
Well, first of all, I think it's quite obvious that there are no politics here, and that the Iranians are more than willing to use all the different vaccines. And with regards to what he says, he has the right to use that vaccine. But there are many scientists who disagree with him, and therefore he shouldn't be so firm in being so absolute. The reality is that the very Pfizer itself is immune from any U.S. citizen to complain, to take them to court. Why do they have immunity? And the government also has immunity. Because the technology is not completely tested. This technology is new. And of course, I agree completely. mRNA is a technology of the future. And it should be pursued. All countries should pursue it. Iran should pursue it. And it will pursue it. And it does pursue it. But the point is that this particular vaccine is new. And traditionally, when a new vaccine is being developed, it takes 4 to 5 years, a number of years, for all the side effects to become clear, what sort of long-term side effects it has. And that is why this particular vaccine was pushed forward through an emergency situation because of the need. The Iranians are saying that, look, we have vaccines that use the long-use technology, and that technology for us is something reliable. We know how it works. The world has been using it. Different vaccines have been produced using that model. mRNA is new. Fine. Work on it. Develop it. Test on people.
Right.
Go
I get
through
your
the
point.
motion. 4 to 5 years down the road, you'll see whether people develop dangerous side effects, cancer, or whatever, or not. And if it isn't, fine, then you move on to the next vaccine, and this technology becomes more developed. But when Iran has access to Chinese vaccines, to Iranian vaccines, to Russian vaccines, to other vaccines in the subcontinent and elsewhere that are based upon a technology that we are more certain about, we are not going to risk the lives of our citizens just because the Americans say so.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Syed Mohammad Marandi speaking with us. I've almost run out of time, but quickly back to Professor Unutmaz. Professor Unutmaz, you want to add something, but very, very quickly.
No, I don't have anything to add. I'm very, very confident about this mRNA technology. As I said, I had the shot myself, and I work in this field for many years. I think it will have an incredible effect on humanity. I'm looking forward as well.
Thank you. That was Professor Derya Unutmaz speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.